Welcome back to I Rest My Case with me, Dean Strang.
And me, Jonathan Goldberg, KC.
I was for over 30 years a full-time criminal defense lawyer in the U.S., and now I'm a full-time law professor. Jonathan, on the other hand, for more than 50 years has been a distinguished barrister in the United Kingdom, devoted largely but not exclusively to criminal defense. He took silk, as they say over there, decades ago, originally as Queen's Counsel and as King's Counsel today. In this podcast, with each episode, we scour the world to dig into an important civil or criminal trial, exploring how the judicial system in each case worked to advance or undermine its stated goals of justice, and what the oft unseen effects were on victims, witnesses, parties, and even the lawyers and judges in those cases. We seek to offer insights from our own experience that the legacy media and social media cannot.
Thank you, Dean. And today we're going to discuss what I can only describe, I think you would agree, as the American Dreyfus case. Because in 1951, there took place in New York the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and a third man called Morton Sobel, who for some reason is much less famous. And this case has been discussed ever since. More books have been written about it. More careers in academia have been made about it. More lectures, more television programs than one can shake a stick at. And of course, there's a tremendous controversy. Were they guilty? Weren't they? Was it a miscarriage of justice? And in any event, was it right to execute two people, the last people ever to be executed for espionage in America? Although, of course, in the Second World War, which had just taken place, a number of Nazi spies were executed, but that's a different thing, obviously. And particularly, was Ethel Rosenberg guilty, and was it right to execute her? So we're going to be discussing all this. Ethel went to the electric chair along with her husband in the infamous Sing Sing prison in New York State in 1953, after a couple of years of failed appeals everywhere that she possibly could. Dean, with that little background, can you tell us more about the detail of this prosecution and its cast of characters? And if you forgive me, I'll intervene with questions that I think our audience would have were they here from time to time.
Of course, of course. And I will say, with the benefit of now more than 70 years hindsight, we can answer many of the questions you posed. Of course, the answers themselves may be disquieting. I think they're in part contradictory. But let's dig into it from the start. Remember that during World War II, which you mentioned just a moment ago, Jonathan, the US and the USSR, and for that matter, Great Britain, were of course allies. What we might call today, though, frenemies as allies, uneasy allies, simply sharing a concern, a fear of the Nazi regime in Germany. After victory in Europe and indeed in the Pacific, that alliance very quickly deteriorated, as most of our listeners know.
You're talking, although you haven't specifically said yet, of the alliance with Joseph Stalin, the autocratic leader of the Soviet Union, of course.
Well, to be allied with the USSR, or the Soviet Union at the time, was to be Joseph Stalin's ally. He had been in functional control of the Soviet Union since 1922. He would remain that way until his death in 1953. He's remembered rightly, in my view, as a totalitarian or an authoritarian, the titular head of a repressive communist regime at the time. So that alliance again falls apart after victory in 1945. And the Cold War era has begun by 1948, if not earlier. In 1949, the USSR announced publicly that it had conducted a successful test of an atomic bomb. Up until then, the United States had been the only known nuclear power in the world, and now there would be two, the United States and the USSR It becomes clear after that Soviet announcement in 1949. Now, since 1943, when the U.S. began its work with the Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb, the United States Army Signal Corps also had been running a secret effort at decrypting Soviet encrypted cables. That Signal Corps effort was called the Venona Project, later taken over by the CEA, I think with some FBI involvement. It continued to run from 1943 to 1980, and it becomes critical to understanding the Rosenberg trial and its aftermath. As it became clear in trying to decrypt these Soviet cables that the Soviets had at least one mole in the Manhattan Project, which was based in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and was our program to develop the atomic bomb, as I said. As it became clear to the Americans and the British that there was at least one Soviet mole embedded in the Manhattan Project, the Venona Project turns to trying to root out the spy or spies. This leads to the 1950 arrest of a British national of German birth, Klaus Fuchs, as he's remembered.
And let me perhaps say a word about him, because I think you'll agree that Fuchs was the real spy here. The others were minions by comparison. They were trading in rubbish. But Fuchs really gave the atom bomb to the Soviets, and they've admitted it ever since. He's a great hero in the Soviet Union and East Germany and places like that. So he was a refugee from the Nazis, the son of a Lutheran minister, a very highly educated family, all of them, his brothers and sisters as well. And he fled. He was a dedicated communist in his youth. He fled as still a young man to Britain, who gave him citizenship, who gave him every possible academic opportunity. And his brilliance as a nuclear scientist was such that he was soon seconded by Britain to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos under the famous J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. So we have a German-born man, as you say, an atomic scientist of great note, who flees to Britain in 1933, eventually is detailed to the Manhattan Project, and is there in Los Alamos. And you're exactly right. He was, in fact, the mole for the Soviets. He's the key spy. He's the one gathering and passing on, ultimately, to the Soviets, secrets about how the U.S. was seeking to construct this atomic bomb and control the fission.
And by the way, and this I find incredible but true, that when he was working at Los Alamos, he was still only in his mid-20s.
Indeed. And we'll come back to him later by way of comparison of the ultimate sentence he serves with the sentences imposed on some of the others. So in any event, he's uncovered, and MI5 arrests him at the request of the FBI in 1950. He confesses, and he implicates his courier, his go-between with the Soviets, Harry Gold, who then in turn fingers a man named David Greenglass, and a non-commissioned U.S. Army officer during the war who was assigned for a time to the Manhattan Project himself in an inglorious clerical role of some kind. Importantly, David Greenglass is by 7 years the younger brother of Ethel Rosenberg. Greenglass and Gold, as they talk, eventually lead the FBI to Julius Rosenberg, and that, of course, leads to Ethel and to Morton Sobel, for that matter. And Greenglass, of course, also has mentioned his wife, Ruth Greenglass, along the way. But the three people of concern to us in the 1951 indictment, at least as it went to trial, are Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobel. They're all charged with conspiracy under the Espionage Act of 1917, one of two big pieces of federal legislation passed in the United States on the cusp of and during the earlier World War, the First World War, and typically made use of in wartime, World War I and World War II, sparingly, although not abandoned, used sparingly after World War II.
Let me say a word perhaps about the background of the Rosenbergs, because it was a fairly typical background of the time, wasn't it? They were the children of immigrant parents from Poland and Russia. They lived in poverty in the Lower East Side tenements of Manhattan. And they became avid communists as very young people, as college students. Not that that was unique to their background, which was particularly that of a Jewish family, but as I say, Fuchs was a Lutheran pastor's son, and he became a communist too in Nazi Germany. And we must remember this was the age of the Spanish Civil War. This was the age where there was so many people who thought Stalin was wonderful, not least because papers like the New York Times covered up atrocities for years, like his famine in Ukraine that he engineered with 5 or 6 million people dying. Indeed, I don't want to go on historically too long, but it's pretty well established now that Stalin killed more people than Hitler even did, more of his own people. But this was not known at the time in the way it's become known since. And so many young people were running off to fight in the Spanish Civil War, were ideologically committed to communism. And that led, of course, to a tremendous communist scare, did it not, in America?
Eventually, certainly by 1950, and in fact, after it is revealed that the Soviet Union had become a nuclear power. And you're right about all of that. Indeed, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Jonathan, I think was the second largest enclave in the world of Jewish diaspora after Warsaw, Poland. And the third largest comes into play here too, which is what was then called Jewish Harlem, a part of Harlem further north on the island of Manhattan that was the third largest Jewish immigrant enclave in the world at the time. And you're exactly right. Both Julius in 1918 and Ethel 3 years earlier in 1915 are born to immigrant parents there on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they grow up as you've described. The men who would prosecute them, and indeed the man who judged them, in some ways had very similar backgrounds. The lead prosecutor was a guy named Irving H. Sapol, who served as the United States Attorney for Manhattan, called the Southern District of New York, from 1949 to 1951. He's the oldest of the crew. He was born in 1905, also on the Lower East Side. He, by the way, prosecuted Alger Hiss famously before the Rosenbergs. Just a footnote about Sapol, as a state court judge, eventually he late in life was indicted himself for bribery and perjury, although those charges were dismissed shortly before his death in 1977. His assistant is in many ways the most famous in our cast of characters here, Roy M. Cohn. Cohn is the youngest of the main characters. He's born in 1927. He in the Bronx and has a relatively privileged and comfortable upbringing, also in New York City, but not from the Lower East Side or Jewish Harlem, as I mentioned before. He is an assistant U.S. attorney from 1948 to 1951 and is Sapol's right-hand man in the prosecution of the Rosenbergs. He's a very, very ambitious and troubling piece of work, is Cohn. He goes straight from the Rosenberg prosecution to become in 1952 the special assistant to the Attorney General for investigating alleged communist sympathizers. From there, the following year in 1953, he goes on to become chief counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy. I'm sorry to say, represented my home state in his day. Chief counsel on the Senate Permanent Subcommittee for Investigations, And Cohn has a starring role whispering in McCarthy's ear during the 1954 Senate Army hearings that eventually lead to McCarthy's undoing.
Wasn't Richard Nixon something to do with that?
Nixon is in the Senate. Nixon's in the Senate at that time, also a Republican. He from California, as I recall, at the time. And I don't remember exactly what role Nixon had in the Senate Army McCarthy
Maybe I'm
hearings.
imagining that, but I thought he and Roy Cohen were very thick as thieves at one time.
Well, they both end up in the New York bar, of course. So I'm certain they know each other, and I should know more about what their connections were. But where I was going with Roy Cohn is he becomes connected eventually. Once McCarthy's in bad odor, Cohn promptly resigns, probably again to pursue his own ambitions and preserve his own reputation. And he becomes a notoriously amoral and unethical lawyer and fixer for New York City's rich and powerful. Celebrities, mafia bosses, politicians, business leaders, including a young Donald Trump. And almost certainly he's connected to Richard Nixon in there. Cohn finally is disbarred in 1986, and he dies later that very same year of AIDS-related illnesses. The final, I think, main participant in that 1951 trial is the judge, Irving R. Kaufman. Born in 1910, he's raised poor in Jewish Harlem, as I've mentioned. Attends Fordham Law School. I think grows up with a great deal of both ability and drive, ambition, but also insecurity. He's mentored by J. Edgar Hoover. He becomes a U.S. Department of Justice trial lawyer, prosecutor, and then is appointed judge at a very young age, 39, the second youngest federal judge at the time when he was appointed. At age 39 in 1949, he's very ambitious, as I said, serves as a district judge from 1949 to 1961. During that time, the Rosenberg case was by far his most famous case. He's promoted by President Kennedy to the U.S. Court of Appeals that covers New York. It's called the Second Circuit in 1961 and serves until his death in 1992.
So remarkably, this is an absolutely all-Jewish show, isn't it? From top to bottom, from the defendants to the judge to the prosecutors, an all-Jewish show. And yet it's so split because you've got on the one side these really communist left-wingers. They're the ones on trial, basically, and their lawyers. And you've got on the other side these complete American nationalists, one could call them, I suppose, make America great again, we would say in today's parlance. And they are so angry and probably ashamed at what their brethren have done, they're determined to throw the book at them.
It's a pattern we've seen in other times and in other places, haven't we, of fresh immigrants or recent immigrants, the children of immigrants, facing, of course, the kind of prejudice and antipathy that many immigrants face or immigrant groups face. And, you know, they either grow up in the United States to become enthusiastic Americans, believing in the hope and dream, as Bruce Springsteen might say, of America, or they become disillusioned with the disadvantaged place and the bias they face and the poverty they face. And for those who do succeed, or who really, you know, embrace the American possibilities, I think often they feel enormous pressure to distance themselves from, you know, co-religionists, people of the same ethnic background, to distance themselves and prove themselves more American than the native born, or more American. These, of course, were native born people, but more American than the descendants, you know, from Plymouth Rock, at great pains to to distinguish themselves from those others, that lest they become confused. And I think that sort of thing seems to run through the performance of both Judge Kaufman and, for that matter, Irving Sapol and Roy Cohn here, in trying to distance themselves from the Rosenbergs and their ilk.
Now, it's been said in so many books since that this trial is a startling example of two things that shouldn't happen. One is prosecution misconduct, that of course didn't come out until years later, but two was judicial misconduct by the judge. Tell us about those two things.
Yeah, both of them are there in unfortunate, ugly measure. It's clear now, we know, that Kaufman, just 2 years on the bench, recall, and with his sights set on higher courts, ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, is trying to engineer that this case be assigned to him of the active federal trial judges in his district in Manhattan. He's meeting with Cohn early on, before the indictment. He's trying to get this case steered to his docket so he can have some time in the limelight, presumably. Cohn is, of course, eager to do that. Sapol is eager to do that. We learn some of this because Cohn confesses it in his later autobiography. And I will say, while Cohn was an inveterate liar, so you would question his credibility standing alone, the wonderful biographer of Judge Kaufman, Martin J. Siegel, in his 2023 biography, who knew Siegel, who knew Kaufman and worked for him as a law clerk, his last law clerk, finds Cohn's details fully consistent with the Irving Kaufman he knew and the Irving Kaufman that 50 law clerks before him, interviewed by Siegel for the biography, also knew. So, there's a real credible sense here of Kaufman working behind the scenes with the U.S. Attorney's Office to get the case steered to him. Once it does, he continues to meet behind the scenes without defense counsel with the prosecutors to discuss the case and presumably to plot its course through the courts. He meets with Irving Sapol the day before he sentences Ethel and Julius Rosenberg to death, for example.
And this is something that the defense counsel at the time knew nothing about.
Knew nothing about. And another thing that defense counsel knew nothing about as to prosecutorial misconduct was the fact that the two Greenglasses, remember Ethel's younger brother David and his wife Ruth, had testified, to put it politely, inconsistently on at least Ethel's role in all of this. At some points under oath before the trial and in front of the grand jury, they denied that Ethel had any role at all in the alleged conspiracy. And at other points, they said, oh, no, she did. She typed up some notes that I, David Greenglass, had handwritten and were to be passed to the Soviets. But we thought better to type them up so the Soviets wouldn't have difficulty with my handwriting in English. So they give inconsistent testimony, some of it utterly exculpating Ethel Rosenberg. And that earlier testimony was never disclosed to the defense by Roy Cohn and Irving Sapol, violating a clear ethical duty, even then, a clear ethical duty to disclose evidence suggesting the lack of credibility of government witnesses or the outright innocence of one or more of the accused.
So let me just stop there, Dean, because my mouth is hanging open, having come from the British tradition. Firstly, the idea that one side of the case, and in particular the prosecution, would be meeting with the judge and them deciding the course of the case, as they must have been doing, because they weren't meeting to have a sherry and discuss the weather, before a case and during a case. And perhaps the during part is the more startling, because to do it before the case in order perhaps to see that the judge will be the judge you want. Okay, it's bad, but I don't know, if he does a fair trial, who cares in some ways? But to do it during the case without the knowledge of the defense, I mean, for sure, that would cause an appeal court in the United Kingdom to quash any conviction immediately, both now and then, I'm sure.
Well, and maybe it would have in the United States, but the appeals court didn't know it. At least for all we can tell, the appeals court had no idea this is going on. I will add, Jonathan, that I don't think it was that unusual. And indeed, there's a strikingly parallel precedent for exactly this if we go back to the preceding World War. Again, go back to World War I. That's the time of the largest mass trial in U.S. history. The trial of 166, well, the indictment of 166 members of the industrial workers of the world in federal court there in Chicago. And a very famous federal judge, or a man who becomes very famous after his time as federal judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, was meeting with the prosecutors, with members of the United States Attorney General's office in advance of that indictment and probably during the course of the case. Why do I say this with such confidence? Because I'm the guy who wrote the book on that IWW 1918 trial, and I uncovered in Justice Department files the telegrams exchanged between the Attorney General of the United States and Judge Landis about arranging their meetings. And later, after the indictment, the Attorney General of the United States damningly refers to Judge Landis as, quote, the main man.
Amazing.
In internal communications with Justice Department lawyers.
You're a man of many parts, Dean, because I never knew you'd written that book, and I can't wait to read it.
We'll cover that trial someday, I hope, in this podcast.
But just before we leave it, do you say that 160 odd people were tried together in one courtroom?
One indictment, 166 defendants. There was a good deal of slop or just loss along the way. The government only ever bothered to arrest 115 of them. I think there were 103 or 101 on the first day of trial, and that gets whittled down during the course of the trial. But by the time the case comes to verdict, after about 3 or 4 months of trial, there's still 90 plus defendants on trial in one courtroom in one case. It is by far the largest mass trial in U.S. history.
Amazing.
All of them found guilty in under an hour by a jury.
They must have had to sit 5 to a chair, I would have thought, just to get them in the room.
They were arrayed throughout the courtroom. Some of them were sleeping, according to news reports during the proceedings. It was an absolute zoo. The judge, Landis, goes on to fame as the first commissioner of Major League Baseball. Still a very famous character in U.S. history because of his role as commissioner of Major League Baseball.
Oh, well, back to the Rosenbergs. And the second matter that has my jaw hanging open is the prosecution failure to disclose the fact that you say their star witness, David Greenglass, without whom I know the Court of Appeal in that case later said there wouldn't have been a prosecution of the Rosenbergs. But the star witness on whose credibility everything turns, you say he had given inconsistent testimony to a grand jury that was not revealed to the defense.
That's correct. Times 2, because his wife, Ruth, did the same thing under oath before trial, inconsistent versions. And to cut to the chase on this, I think what really happens is that by the time trial comes around, David Greenglass has been put to the remarkably brutal choice of sacrificing his sister to spare his wife. And Ruth has gone along with it. She is never prosecuted. She had a greater role, it appears, than Ethel did, David's sister. And the government has put him to this choice deliberately. And then when he changes his story to implicate his sister, they conceal the truth of his earlier version of events and hers. So at trial, there turn out to be only 4 important witnesses at this trial. David and Ruth Greenglass are two of those four, and the only two who implicated Ethel in what is just a conspiracy charge. It's not even a completed crime that is charged here. Now, to be sure, to be clear, Julius Rosenberg was guilty and was guilty of helping to pass atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. We know that from the disclosure of later files. But he was charged only with conspiracy, that is, with an unlawful agreement to do that, not with actually completing the act of disclosing the country's secrets. He's charged only with conspiracy, as was his wife and Morton Sobel. And there's precious little evidence linking Ethel to that conspiracy, to that criminal agreement. The only evidence being that she typed up notes on one occasion, according to David and Ruth Greenglass, who we know when the grand jury transcripts are released, it's much more complicated, and that their inconsistent version was not disclosed to the defense. And we know from 2001, late in his life, David Greenglass admits to a New York Times reporter, "I lied, I perjured myself, and so did my wife, and I saved my wife's life by doing that."
So he really condemned his 7-year-older sister in order to save his own wife, Ruth.
I think that's what it comes down to. Now, would Ruth have faced the death penalty? Who knows? But she would have faced indictment and didn't. And this is part of the pattern, at least of US law. You know, if you cooperate with the government, if you do the government's bidding, better things happen to you. So, for example, Harry Gold, the courier here, the go-between, pleads guilty eventually, and he's sentenced to 30 years in prison for his espionage conspiracy and ends up serving 15 years. Greenglass, who's much more helpful in the end to the government, is sentenced to 15 years on his guilty plea and ends up serving just under 10.
Now, it's an interesting comparison, isn't it? Because you've said, and modern scholars all now accept, although be it said that for decades there was a tremendous controversy in America and there were partisans on both sides, whether Julius Rosenberg was guilty or was framed as well as his wife.
I think it has to be said that he was guilty at this point, with what we know.
So now let's assume that he was guilty, but he certainly put up a jolly good show denying it. And his wife, Ethel, went into the witness box. They both did. And she equally was vociferous in pleading his innocence and her own innocence. Now, if he was guilty, which we now accept he was all along, albeit not as of doing as bad things as Klaus Fuchs, or even as doing as many bad things as the prosecution were then alleging against him. But Ethel and Julius, I think everybody accepts, were the most loving and close couple possible. To read, as I've recently done, Anne Sobel's book about their time in prison together. They were allowed to meet but not touch a couple of times a week through iron grills, and the letters which they wrote to each other, and indeed to their sons, and we'll be saying more about the sons in due course. But those letters, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by them, and not to be moved by how wonderful this marriage was on any view. So what I'm leading up to is this. They'd been married, I forget how many years, but it was substantial. It was, I think, 14 or 15, something like that, when this disaster happened to them, when their lives exploded. A wife, she's making him 5,000 cups of coffee. She's watching over his shoulder. She's party to his friends and his activities, and she must have known what was going on, bearing in mind also she was a committed communist from a very young age. So it's naive, isn't it, to think that she was entirely innocent. She must have been complicit, can I suggest, to some extent in his activities.
I agree with you up to a point, and this is maybe the difference between moral innocence, or innocence, broadly writ, and legal innocence. Simply knowing of the existence of a conspiracy doesn't make you guilty of it. You've got to join it. You've got to intend to join it, intend that it succeed in its objectives. And let's assume you're right, because I think common sense would suggest that with a close marriage, the relationship that the Rosenbergs had, she would have known, at least generally, what Julius was up to, and she clearly sympathized with the communist cause. She was committed to that, as was Julius, even after they dropped out of the actual Communist Party. And so that, in the broader moral sense, would make her not entirely innocent. In the legal sense, she still would be innocent had she not intended to join the criminal agreement and help its objectives succeed.
Yes, I see that.
Now, she wouldn't have had to commit what's called an overt act herself. She wouldn't have had to lift a finger necessarily, but she would have had to intend to join and assist the success of the conspiracy's objectives.
So I accept.
There is a difference between legal innocence and innocence more broadly.
I accept that, Dean.
Of course,
but there's another issue here. There's another issue here.
No, there's a number of other issues.
Many other issues.
Yes.
We could go on about this one all week. But I was going to say, so you've got a wife who gives evidence saying that her darling husband is as innocent as the day is long, as is she, right?
And I want to come back to that.
Let me just finish. Let me just finish my point, if you'd allow me. You've got the government who, from the beginning, J. Edgar Hoover and the justice people, we now know that from the very beginning, they're trying to use Ethel as a lever to get Julius to admit his own guilt, like his brother-in-law had done, and to disclose other Russian spies, because he was essentially the leader of a group, was Julius. He was the controller of a group. So they want him to say who the others were, and that there were others, there can be no doubt whatever, others who have escaped. So they're using Ethel as a lever. If you spill the beans, we'll treat you like David, in effect. We didn't go against his wife Ruth, we won't go against your wife Ethel. It's up to you. But now, given they're so close, isn't it extraordinary that she didn't beg her husband, you know you've done it, I know you've done it, please don't sacrifice me, do the decent thing like David has done, admit it, get a low sentence, and let me go free. And yet, literally to the door of the electric cell, both of them are still pleading innocence. Bizarre.
I don't know. It's tragic. Let's try to unpack it, okay? First of all, there appears to be solid evidence that indeed J. Edgar Hoover directed explicitly that the government try to use Ethel as a lever, as you say, to get Julius to cooperate, to force him into cooperating, disclosing other names, testifying if necessary on behalf of the government. And he didn't do that. He did not do that. Hoover, interestingly, after the convictions and sentence, Hoover somewhat relents, recognizing that it's potentially going to be counterproductive to execute Ethel. And he suggests commuting her sentence. It doesn't get commuted. She does, in fact, go to the electric chair. But at the time, before trial, he's using brass knuckles here, so to speak, or ruthless tactics, as the government will, to try to press Julius, who it views as a very, very bad man, to cooperate and spare his wife altogether, or at least spare her from the possibility of a death sentence. All right, we don't know what the proposed deal would have been for Ethel, but it's clear that Hoover is trying to leverage Ethel's existence to get Julius to cooperate. You are quite right. He doesn't, and she, of course, doesn't. Now, I want to say this about Ethel's testimony at trial. You've described it as vociferous and full-throated and whatnot. In fact, it appears from the accounts of the trial that she had a kind of icy, cold, matter-of-fact demeanor on the stand. She certainly denied guilt, but in a sort of rote, mechanical way, with those thin, pursed lips. And of course, I'm describing things that have nothing to do with actual guilt or innocence, but have everything to do with demeanor, what the jury is seeing, the appearance. I can't say there were no Jews on the jury, but I would be surprised if there were Jews on this jury. I would be surprised if there were people sympathetic in general to the milieu and views of the Rosenbergs. And you've got at the time an underlying, it's complicated, right? On the one hand, a sort of misogynist view of women, and radical women in particular were often portrayed, as was Ethel, as being manipulative, cold, orchestrating things behind the scenes, directing the men, but staying out of the fray themselves. On the one hand, you've got that, and on the other, as you both know, in both of our countries, you have a long-standing sort of unwritten code of leaving the women out of it. An unwritten rule of honor that we don't go after the wives.
And that applies both to cops and robbers, doesn't it?
It does, and to prosecutors. There's that.
I mean, it's just so normal almost that the burglar will say, "Okay, Gov, I will admit it, and you've done me like a kipper." As one of my clients once said, a burglar, he told the policeman, "You've done me like a kipper." He said, "I'll make a full admission, providing you leave my wife out of it." And of course,
leave my wife out.
And of course, the jewelry was literally found on his wife's fingers in due course. But that was the code of honor.
And American drug dealers have done the same, for decades, if not longer. And often the police and the prosecutors are willing to let it be that way. They secure the cooperation or the guilty plea of the male actors and leave out their girlfriends and their wives. So here, of course, you've got two conflicting things at work, as you often do in legal systems. A kind of a skeptical view of Ethel's demeanor on the witness stand, and maybe her physical appearance, probably, in part her physical appearance on the one hand, and on the other hand, an off-ramp because she's got a double X chromosome rather than having a Y chromosome in her genome, and probably could have worked out a deal, or Julius could have. We know he could have here.
Well, for sure he could have, because of course David had done it,
and Ruth did.
Ruth did.
David did it,
and Ruth on any view of the evidence, really the admitted evidence on any view, Ruth was doing much more towards this conspiracy than ever Ethel was, taking the worst view.
Yes. That's exactly right. So it's complicated, as so much is, right? And very human.
So poor Ethel. I'm left with the impression that Ethel, who, as you say, was incredibly tight-lipped and buttoned up and reserved, and that was her personality. Although when you read her letters and when you learn what she was saying to her husband and her children, you realize actually she wasn't like that at all. Like so many of us, she looks one thing and in truth was another inside.
A public persona, nervous and on the witness stand for her life, that's one thing, and a reality that's something very different to those who love her.
I hear what you're saying about her performance in court, and I can quite see how her nervousness would have made her appear arrogant and aloof.
Yes. Now, there's another strictly legal issue here that we really do need to talk about. She didn't have separate representation at trial. Two brothers, the Block brothers, Emmanuel and Alexander, as I remember, defended both Julius and Ethel. A common thing in that day, even by the 1950s, a common thing for one lawyer or one legal team to represent more than one client. But here, utterly tragic and horrible, certainly from our perspective today, because had she independent counsel worried only about her, ethically bound to worry about her well-being rather than also worrying about Julius's well-being, it's inconceivable that independent counsel wouldn't have tried to focus on the lesser role and even the fragility of the testimony against her, even not knowing about the earlier inconsistent sworn testimony that both Greenglasses had given. It's really inconceivable to me that had she had her own lawyer and had that lawyer been competent, that there wouldn't have been an effort to distinguish Ethel, to the detriment possibly of Julius, but to distinguish her from Julius and Morton and all of the other conspirators.
So that's really a conflict of interest. I mean, I would have thought today.
Oh, it's an enormous.
I would have thought today those two Bloch brothers, the defending lawyers for Julius and Ethel, who are in the same firm, I would have thought they could have been disbarred for doing that.
In the day, no. I mentioned the IWW trial of nearly 100. They were all represented by one defense team. It's inconceivable today. But you have to remember this. Here's the context for this. At the time, if you wanted a lawyer, that's grand. You have a right to that under the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but you also had to pay for the lawyer. And if you're people of modest means, scraping together from family members and wherever else you can, the cookie jar, to hire a lawyer, you're not likely to be able to hire two.
And not much has changed even today.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, at least in the United States. They're tried in 1951 when that's the rule, essentially. You want a lawyer, pay for it under almost any circumstance. And so you scrape together the money, you hire a lawyer, and that lawyer represents both of you. After all, you're husband and wife, your interests generally are aligned. You trust each other. It's 12 years later, in 1963, when the U.S. Supreme Court interprets the Sixth Amendment right to counsel to say that the indigent person has a right to defense counsel representing him or her at public expense.
And the theory is wonderful, but the quality of counsel that you actually get as an indigent person is not going to be the same that you get if you pay.
It really depends. At least here in the United States, that depends. There certainly are what we would call appointed counsel or public defenders who are not as talented as the best private lawyers you could hire. But there are lots of private lawyers you can hire on whom you're wasting your money. And you'd be better off with a skilled indigent defender, public defender, or appointed counsel. But of course, if you're indigent, you don't get to pick your lawyer. You get to pick your lawyer only if you're in a position to hire that lawyer.
Let's tell the public something, our listeners something that I think we both agree on, that in reality, you can pay a fortune for the most famous lawyers, the most famous solicitors or barristers in town, and yet you're only as good as the person holding the file within that great big firm and high windows, and you never actually, know who's holding the file.
With that, I agree completely. And I want to add a nuance to that, if I may. The Bloch brothers were famed. They were well-regarded lawyers in their day. They also were leftists themselves. I don't know if they were communists. I'm not saying that, but their sympathies were far left at the time. And I think there can be a real risk to hiring lawyers in a heavily politicized case, or one with political overtones, who are overly sympathetic with you and maybe using you as the client to advance their own views of how the world ought to work, or at least may have blind spots because they share the political views or sympathies of their clients. There obviously can be advantages to that, getting along with your lawyer, maybe trusting your lawyer, but there really can be disadvantages with a lawyer who's drinking the same Kool-Aid as the client.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I've always avoided any case, I've refused cases if for whatever reason my politics or my personal life or anything of that kind had any connection with the case or the client. I remember one case I did where a co-defending lawyer in a very large conspiracy case at the Old Bailey, he found himself the front pages of the Times and every other newspaper when it emerged in court that he personally had attended the wedding of his client's son, some very extravagant wedding feast. And that proved very embarrassing.
Well, and those kind of personal ties can complicate the lawyer's task of, trying to bring an objective eye and untainted judgment to what's going to best serve the client.
But putting this simply, what you're saying is that if you or I had been defending Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, whether you and I, who are like brothers or not, we would have said, you, Ethel, have got to have completely separate representation for the simple reason that in order to defend you most effectively, your lawyer has got to say that your husband may be guilty. I'm not saying he is, but he may be, the jury may think, but that doesn't make you guilty as well. And you can't say that if you're the same lawyer, because then you're unfaithful to Julius.
Exactly, Jonathan. And well-functioning but separate lawyers could have said, look, we're not going to do anything on behalf of Julius to trip up Ethel. And we're not going to do anything on behalf of Ethel to make things worse for Julius. But that said, I'm representing Julius and the other lawyer is representing Ethel, and we're going to do our level best for our clients. And if that happens to produce a detriment for the other spouse, so be it. And I think had there been independent lawyers, and had I been representing Ethel and not Julius, I would have had to have a heart-to-heart with her about saying, look, you love this man. You believe in him. You don't want him to go to the electric chair, but you are the mother of 2 young boys. You have something else to live for as well. Don't leave your sons orphans if we can avoid this, and we've got to do what's best for you. And in his heart of hearts, surely Julius agrees with that. I think that's the conversation one would have had to have repeatedly with Ethel.
The picture I'm getting from you is that this really was a dreadful trial because they didn't have a chance, the Rosenbergs. They had a prosecutor who was hiding evidence. That's what it amounts to. He was actively hiding evidence that would have tended to acquit them. They have a judge who's bent and biased and is meeting behind the scenes with the prosecution to fix the outcome. They have lawyers of their own who are pushing their own left-wing political agenda and are not actually telling them you need separate representation so that one can blame the other to the extent that will strictly be necessary according to the way the evidence comes out. And then they're their own worst enemies, as though that wasn't enough. They're their own worst enemies because Ethel is clearly not doing what Ruth Greenglass was doing, and who told her husband, you jolly well take the rap so that I can look after the children and I'm not sent to prison. And it worked for her, and it would have worked for Ethel. There's no reason to think it wouldn't. But you have Ethel saying, I'm going to be a martyr and go down with my husband, as she did.
That's how it appears to me. And the objective evidence bears that out in large part. We're filling in some gaps here with our own guesses and educated inferences, but that's how it looks to me, Jonathan. And, one of the interesting codas to this is I mentioned the Venona Project and the effort to decrypt Soviet cables that began during World War II and that ultimately uncovered Klaus Fuchs and that, unravels this whole group. The Venona Project files finally get declassified by the US government in 1995, 1996, and they get released. And the grand jury testimony that showed the Greenglasses changed their story, that's not till something like 2015. But the Venona files get released in 1995 and 1996, and they are a treasure trove at getting at the truth. They reveal, for example, that every one of these people, Fuchs, Gold, Greenglass, Julius Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass. Every one of them, the Soviets have given a code name. How do the Soviets refer to Ethel? As Julius's wife, once or twice, at most twice in their cables. She doesn't have a code name. She alone among these people doesn't have a code name, and she's an afterthought. It's mentioned that Julius is married, and her name is Ethel.
And not just that, I recall there's one of these cables which actually says she knows what's going on and is loyal to her husband, but she's not active herself.
Yes, yes. And so when those get released in the mid 1990s, a number of journalists and authors dig in who are among the most significant in combing those files and the trial testimony and anything they can get their hands on through a Freedom of Information Act request. But the sons of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So they were little boys at the time their parents were tried and then imprisoned and executed. And they later get raised by a couple named Mirapol, and they changed their last names to Robert and Michael Rosenberg. They changed their last names to Mirapol and are raised to adulthood by loving surrogate parents or, foster parents at that point. And they both go on to become distinguished scholars themselves. And they are two of the people who dug into these Venona files and explored what could be found there, mined all the material they could get, and wrote it up, made it available to the public. I think coming to the regretful conclusion that their father was guilty, but that their mother was at least not legally guilty and certainly didn't merit execution.
The government, the prosecution, Hoover, they will have known what was in the Venona files because that was active intelligence that was being mined at the time, but wasn't released publicly until 1995. So with that knowledge that releasing those cables alone would have acquitted Ethel, because the cables are saying she's not part of the conspiracy. She knows, but she's not active. Well, that's a complete defense to a conspiracy, as I understand it. So they sat on that. I mean, it's the real conspiracy here is the prosecution and the judge.
That's one of them, the prosecution, the judge, and the other prosecutors and law enforcement agents. Back to your point about who is the actual spy here. He was the man most responsible for this, is Klaus Fuchs. He's not prosecuted in the US at all. He's prosecuted in the United Kingdom. And what does he get for his role in all this?
Well, you see, this is how civilized the British are. So not only that, but I've read part of his interrogation by somebody I later greatly admired, who became a High Court judge called Mr. Justice Milmo, and he'd been an MI5 agent. Very nice guy, actually. Remember him very fondly as a judge. But he was the man who interrogated Klaus Fuchs and eventually got him to confess. And it's like you and I it's like a conversation you and I are having now. We might be having a cup of tea and a cake. I think they probably were. And Fuchs denied it at first, but after a lot of patient cross-examination, he then admitted it. So Fuchs was tried at the Old Bailey. He pleaded guilty. The entire case lasted under 90 minutes, and the then Lord Chief Justice, Lord Goddard, gave him the maximum sentence which the law then permitted. It's been increased since, but at the time it was 14 years under the British Espionage Act. So he got 14. He served, I think, a little under 10. And what happened to him then? He was then a very young man still. He was then still well on the right side of 40. I made an error earlier. I said that he was in his mid-20s when he started working at Los Alamos. He was in his late 20s and early 30s, but still a very young man. So he leaves prison. He goes straight to East Germany, where he's treated as a hero, and they immediately appoint him to be deputy director of their atomic institute, because he was obviously still a brilliant scientist. And guess what? He marries the lady who first recruited him into the Communist Party when they were both at university. So in a sense, it's rather sweet, although in a sense it isn't sweet at all, because this is the man who gave Russia the atom bomb many years before they would have got it legitimately, as the Soviets themselves have publicized many times since. So you can argue he's one of the terrible villains of the age. I would argue that, actually. A totally honored man. And here's the poor Rosenbergs. The poor Rosenbergs, and in particular Ethel, who shouldn't have been on trial or imprisoned even at all. She should have been in a more favorable position than her sister-in-law, Ruth Greenglass. And yet, because her husband wouldn't do the honorable thing, as I see it, and I'd like you to comment on that, but as I see it, David Greenglass was oddly enough more honorable than Julius, because David said, I'll sacrifice my older sister, who he probably didn't like much anyway. Not everybody likes their older sister. I'm only kidding, Sandra. And he sacrificed his sister to save his wife. Julius wouldn't even admit guilt himself and did nothing to save his wife.
So it appears it's just remarkable.
Terrible thing, really.
In a sense, this case finally ends completely just 7 years ago in 2018, when Morton Sobel, the third man who went to trial, was sentenced to 30 years, as I said, by Judge Kaufman. He passed away finally in 2018 at the age of 101 years old.
We haven't said much about him, but on my reading of the case, there was precious little evidence against him at all. And really, at highest, he was a sort of glorified courier.
Yes.
And he didn't pass on atomic secrets. He passed on lesser military secrets because he happened to be working for General Electric, who were involved in some military invention, but it wasn't atomic.
That's exactly right, or at least at his superannuated age, 10 years before he died at age 91, he admitted that he had passed non-atomic secrets, had had a role in that. He was guilty, certainly not of passing atomic secrets, but of passing other secret U.S. government information on to those who then share it with the Soviets.
So God knows what he was really doing in the same dock as the others anyway, because they were accused of passing on atomic secrets, and he wasn't.
It's not a case that casts the U.S. legal system in great light. Clearly, Roy Cohn is enormously ambitious in using this, the lives and deaths of other people to advance his own career.
And he succeeded in that.
And he succeeded very much in it. Erwin Kaufman, the judge, did much the same. His motives are, I'm sure, much more clouded, given his own desire to appear a loyal American, which he was. He succeeds in going up to the next higher court, but he has his eye all along, it's clear, on the U.S. Supreme Court. And at the time, there was what was called a Jewish seat, informally.
Yes.
And only one, of the 9. Felix Frankfurter held it. And Frankfurter writes a private letter to another very famous American judge who sat on the Second Circuit with Erwin Kaufman eventually. This man, Learned Hand, again, a very famous U.S. judge. Frankfurter writes to Hand saying, I'm just mean enough to stay in the chair long enough so that Kaufman can't get the Jewish seat, because I don't appreciate a man who goes to temple and comes out claiming that God told him to impose the death penalty.
Oh, isn't that interesting? We must be disillusioning our I Rest My Case audience, because they probably thought justice was above all these things. It was about truth and integrity and objectivity. I hate to think what they'll think after they listen to this episode.
I suspect some few of them already have doubts about what you just said, Jonathan. But you're right. We haven't allayed those doubts. And we can't, in all honesty.
Dean, let me ask you a difficult, even an embarrassing question. And obviously, it's very academic. Suppose you or I had been on that jury that convicted the Rosenbergs, both of them unanimously, back in 1951, under the stern gaze of Judge Kaufman, who was trying to push it that we should all along. We've been on that jury. We've got three defendants. We've got Julius, we've got Ethel, we've got Morton Sobel. And we've got to put ourselves as the jury were, knowing what they knew at the time, not knowing what has come out, thanks to the historians like the Sons and the Venona Project and the rest of it. And indeed, Russian files have been opened as well. We don't know any of that. We're on the jury in 1951. But I'm going to ask you, what would your vote have been on each of the three?
Well, I wouldn't have known that the Greenglasses may have perjured themselves at trial. And I would be tempted to say, a brother wouldn't falsely describe what his sister had done, knowing that she could face death if convicted. A brother surely wouldn't do that. I, of course, don't know how David Greenglass or Ruth Greenglass actually came across on the witness stand. But as a juror, myself, knowing my own opposition to the death penalty and my skepticism about the punishment we mete out in U.S. courts, I might have been tempted, even if I believed them, to ignore the law and say I didn't believe them, that I wasn't persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt that she had joined this conspiracy. I'd like to think I would have been tempted to do that. Now, that would be, in a sense, if I was dishonest about what I did and didn't believe, that would be to return a verdict in the teeth of what the law required. On the other hand, it's easy enough to say I'm left with a reasonable doubt, and maybe I would have been left with a reasonable doubt. What I can say, Jonathan, is that had I known as a juror, as I should have been allowed to know, that Ruth and David had given contrary testimony under oath to an earlier grand jury, there's not a chance I would have believed their trial testimony beyond a reasonable doubt. I would have acquitted Ethel and I suppose might well have convicted Julius.
Yes. Well, of course, that only shows that you're a much nicer person than I am, which I knew already. Although let me say straight away that when you can't believe that a brother would do this to his sister, unless he were telling the truth, you don't know Jewish families the way I do. But that's a joke only I can make. That's a joke only I can make. But to come back to the question, if I were on that jury, I think the way that case was presented at the time, I think I'd have probably thought, what a fine regular fellow this judge is. And how awful they are to have abused the hospitality of America, which has been so good to them, and behave in this way. And I'm sure I would have found Julius guilty, which is the right verdict because he was. I'm sure I would have found Ethel guilty because I'd have said to myself, oh, of course she knew. She was such a loyal, devoted and close wife, and everything points to the fact that you couldn't, in a small family like this, you couldn't know that your brother-in-law and sister-in-law who've been recruited by your husband without knowing yourself. He would, he's going to have told you on the pillow. So I'm afraid I would have found her guilty as well. Poor Sobel, I would have acquitted.
Interesting. Would knowing that a death sentence was either certain or likely have affected you as a juror?
Well, again, you will never speak to me again, but I am in favor of the death penalty. With what goes on nowadays, in particular with the horrific crimes, the terrorist crimes, that's a big subject of debate, and perhaps we'll do it more.
But you haven't really answered my question. I mean, one can favor the death penalty, and you might have had qualms about its application here. And I'm just curious whether you would have had qualms even supporting the death penalty.
I would have had qualms because I would have thought it's an awful lot for Ethel. And I might have written a note, as jurors can in the UK. They can add a rider for mercy. Can they do that in America?
Nobody stops them, but they're not invited to do that.
Same story. They're not invited, and you need an intelligent juror who would know that he can do it. So I would have been that intelligent juror, and I would have done a rider asking the judge not to execute Ethel.
So
But
just think about the unseen, in a sense, victims of the ambition of these prosecutors and that judge. By concealing the evidence of perjury that they did, and by advocating brilliantly, as they did, for guilty verdicts against these two people, had any of those jurors lived long enough to learn the truth of this in the 90s, they would have been left saying, my God, I convicted and sent to death a likely innocent woman. And, by the way, had I known that David and Ruth were capable of changing their story under oath, saying entirely contradictory things under oath, I wonder how much I would have believed them as to Julius as well. Now, we know later that
yes,
Julius, in fact, was guilty, but if all they had were the Greenglasses, and had they known that the Greenglasses were perjurers, suborned by the prosecutors and the law enforcement agents, would those jurors have felt enormous guilt at their role? They didn't decide the sentence, but they returned the verdict that made that sentence likely.
yes, it just shows what an imperfect system you and I have worked in all these years. People don't realize how imperfect it is. And as an afterthought, of course, the prosecutors should have been in prison. They were appalling the way they behaved. This brings our first series to a close, but the questions raised remain long after the verdicts. For now, I rest my case, but we both will be back soon.